In 1989, Capcom released Sweet Home, an NES horror game based off of a recently released film of the same name. The game was an RPG, and despite being well received in Japan, it never saw a release stateside because America hates RPGs and fun, which is coincidentally the same reason why your cool uncle still insists that Final Fantasy VI is Final Fantasy III, actually. Sweet Home tasked players with exploring a dilapidated mansion looking for a famous artist's abandoned frescoes, which players did by fighting off monsters, solving puzzles, and collecting items to unlock new parts of old areas in a very Metroidvania-like fashion. Well, technically I guess just a Metroid fashion. Symphony of the Night wouldn't be released for a while, so Metroid-y fashion. The game did fairly well, and a few years later Capcom wanted to remake the game for the fancy new 3D system on the rise, the Sony PlayStation. Unfortunately, by that point they had lost the rights to the game since again it was a licensed game for a movie that at that point no one really cared about, and instead had to pivot to creating a brand new IP.
Resident Evil.
Said new IP released in '96 under the title of Resident Evil or Biohazard in Japan. And yes, that does mean what you think it means for Resident Evil 7. Now, a lot of you might be saying, Max, this is a very well-known Resident Evil fact. Some would say almost a surface-level piece of RE trivia, to which I would say, shut up. You dork, let me do my intro, Jesus. Directed by Shinji Mikami and produced by many people that would go on to become incredibly influential in gaming, one of whom did so by blocking you on Twitter, the game was beloved for the sense of horror and tension it spawned in players as they explored the Spencer Mansion as either Chris or the Master of Unlocking.
Here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the Master of Unlocking, take it with you.
Is making fun of the original game for bad voice acting a played-out joke at this point? Yes. Will I still continue to do it anyway? Absolutely. And you would too. It's ridiculous. Just look at it.
I'm sorry for my lack of manners, but I'm not used to escorting men.
Moving on. RE started on the PS1, and people have been arguing about it ever since. It obviously wasn't the original horror game, but it defined the shape of the genre for decades to come by asking the crazy question of what if I gave the characters in my horror game a gun?
Oops, looks like culture's been changed forever.
Everyone say thank you, Shinji Mikami. Calling the first game a success would be probably one of the biggest understatements ever. It spawned a series that was a cornerstone of Capcom for over a decade before it very suddenly wasn't, and then very suddenly was again in 2017. This is a joke, by the way. People shit on RE5 and 6 all the time, but they still bought them. If you tally up all of the different versions of RE5 and 6, they would be Capcom's third and sixth best-selling games of all time. A million of you bought RE6 on the fucking Switch 7 years after it first came out. Explain yourselves. For a while, it seemed like each entry was better and better, each one carving its own path and its own identity for the series. Obviously, the big standouts, though, were the first game and the fourth, two of the most influential games of all time, but in completely different ways. Everyone again say thank you, Shinji Mikami. Yet, despite the financial success and overall critical success, at least in one of their cases, that RE5 and 6 had, as anyone who was online in the early 2010s could tell you, people hated these games. YouTubers, gaming outlets, dumbasses on forums, your friend's weird older brother that always smelled like a skunk, everyone and anyone would shit on these games and talk about how much of a shame it was that the games were going in the same direction as the movies. That they were prioritizing action over being scary, not like the old games used to be. That they weren't horror games anymore. So it would stand to reason then, right? That the old games were pretty terrifying and the new ones were just entirely action schlock. Right? Surely the collective of gamer rage wasn't directed at Capcom's Golden Boy for somewhat invalid reasons, right? Let's chat, shall we? For almost the entirety of its existence, Resident Evil has been going through an identity crisis. What is the focus of the game? Is it a tense, scary horror joint, a campy B-movie, an action movie? Is it more George Romero or John Romero? Is it any one thing, really? Before we jump in, I would like to make 3 things abundantly clear. Number 1, first and foremost, this is all my opinion. Please do not yell at me, I will cry. This is all a very subjective look from my perspective. If YouTube was a newspaper and I had never had a real job outside of being a talking flesh puppet of whoever pays my rent, you would find this video in the opinion column section. 2. Despite what I may say in the next however many minutes, I love all of the Resident Evil games. Not equally, obviously, and I won't pretend to have played every single one, but I can honestly say I've never played a Resident Evil game that I didn't like. They could never make me hate you, RE3 make. And 3. Horror is obviously subjective. Since I'm talking about the franchise as a whole here, I don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty for every scene or every game, but when I do talk specifics, I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to say definitive, this part was scary or this part wasn't, because that's just my opinion. More so, I'm trying to say what I think the intention of the developers were with these such things. More so, was this supposed to be scary? And for the sake of consistency here, when I do want to touch on very specific things or give a general overview of certain concepts and I need examples, I will pull from the first game, Resident Evil 1. I think the best way to start here is to kind of outline what I mean, right? For starters, I'm not really concerned with a lot of the spin-offs of the series. Let's be real, those games kind of tend to suck a lot. Umbrella Chronicles, the railgun shooters, whatever. Getting hit by raw launcher from Wesker in Marvel 3 is scarier than Resident Evil Resistance. And he's not even really that good in that game. For the purposes of my little spiel here, Resident Evil consists of the 8 mainline games, Code Veronica, and the remakes which I played. Sorry, Zero, I didn't play you yet, but I know you're basically Resident Evil 1 with some sweet home mechanics thrown in that people don't really like.
I know what you are!
It's fine. And the other key point to this is, what do we mean by horror? Resident Evil is, after all, survival horror, right? Well, what exactly is that? Well, it's kind of a tricky question, isn't it? Survival horror is a subgenre of horror games, but it's not itself just a blanket horror. It's kind of like how every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square. There are many differences between the two, and the biggest one is that survival horror incorporates the gameplay directly into the horror. And I don't mean like with monsters or zombies or jump scares or anything, but rather through the sense of desperation and survival instinct that the game instills in you as a player. Some of the hallmarks of the genre include deadly enemies blocking your path, limited ammunition and scarce resources, dark creepy areas where anything could be around the corner, and isolation, with bonus points for scattering little notes around to add to the story as you find them. Usually, survival horror games have very few NPCs, and the ones that they do have are ones you encounter infrequently, like What's-His-Face in Signalis, or ones that stay in the same place while you go out and return and do all the hard stuff. Looking at you, Richard. Ugh, I got bit by a giant venomous snake. Ugh, I'm gonna die. I'm in pain. Help me, Jill. Imagine being so inconsequential the game is an achievement that kind of pokes fun at you if you save his life.
This house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
You're wounded. What kind of demon attacked you?
It was a huge snake, and also poisonous.
Pathetic.
Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying survival horror isn't scary or isn't even horror, just that it's a different kind of horror and different kind of scares, one that prioritizes tension over straight scares. Horror media takes many different forms, no surprise there, and as a result, they're not all the same, nor do they inspire the same type of fear. For instance, the feelings you get from playing Outlast are very different than when you play Resident Evil 2. Both are scary, involving lurking around a bunch of spooky areas with limited visibility, risk of dismemberment, and creepy weirdos, but they're not the same. Sure, Outlast has some resource management with the camera and batteries, but running low on batteries inspires a very different type of fear than being chased in a dark police station by 2 zombies when you only have 1 bullet left. Important disclaimer here, I'm not saying that either of these is better than the other or even more scarier than the other. That's obviously a very personal choice, but I am saying that there is a distinction between the two. That's all. The way I think of it is, survival horror tends to split the horror elements into 2 parts, the actual scary thing itself and how you react to it. Now what I mean by that is how the situation you find yourself in builds the additional fear and tension. For example, take the dogs in the hallway of Resident Evil 1, remake or original. No matter which one, at some point the dogs will jump through the window of the hallway and ambush you, right? And this is a scary moment for obvious reasons, and as such it is designed to be so, fitting for our first half of that equation. The other part here is not in the developer's direct control, but the player's. It's how prepared you are for it, which is something that's hard to do as you have no idea it's coming most likely. If you walk down this hallway with an inventory full of shotgun ammo, then once you've recovered from the shock of their appearance, you can make like a Beyblade and let it rip. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy, go past go, collect $200. But in the more likely event that you probably have very limited resources, maybe a couple bullets here and there across 2 different guns, a knife, and 1 herb, you get tense because you know technically how you're supposed to deal with this, but you also know that you don't have the equipment to do so. You know that you only have 1 more heal and it's been so long since you saved, oh god, oh fuck, oh god. god. And so you have to make a split-second decision to fight or run, fight or flight, right? If you fight, even if you win, you'll sorely miss all of that ammo and health, but if you run, you have to remember that the dogs are there and that you can't go down that hall again unless you're prepared to deal with them. Giving the player the ability to fight back at all obviously lessens the horror. You're not as scared of something that you know you can beat, but the trade-off that survival horror makes is that the tension from the quick mental gymnastics of counting your inventory, analyzing the situation, and deciding on fight or flight really adds to the scare factor. It makes you feel desperate and out of time, because you are. This idea and type of situation is seen time and time again throughout the entire RE series, and is what delineates survival horror from regular horror games and what made RE so unique at the time. Survival horror derives its horror predominantly from the environments it occurs in, and the control the game has over the resources that it gives you. This is the largest reason why, in my opinion, the RE games aren't really that scary on subsequent playthroughs, and they're not really trying to be. Of course, once you know exactly where to go for the items you need and can keep better stock of your weapons and ammo because you know drop locations, not to mention knowing how to deal with various enemies, that aspect of the scare factor tends to fade out pretty quickly. It's never a cakewalk, but trekking through the mansion is never as frightening on round 2. Even in games with much more distinct playthroughs like Leon and Claire's routes in RE2, since you're already familiar with the environment and minute-to-minute gameplay, that aspect of the tension is pretty much gone. There's still some unique scary parts, but overall the minute-to-minute stuff just doesn't invoke the same fear that it once did. Now, a semi-elephant in the room here is that horror is also by necessity a very nebulous concept, right? It changes constantly and has no one definition because what scares you might not be scary to me, and what scared me when I was 15 probably doesn't scare me now. Most importantly though, the concept of horror can change not just from period to period and work to work, but also from scene to scene. As an example, take a look at Alien, one of the best horror movies ever made, which has very different horror at the start than it does at the end. Now, there's obviously something to be said about viewer expectation in horror helping to build tension. You know you're watching a horror movie, but since very few movies start with the bad stuff right out of the gate, you have to wait and watch for the characters to learn they're in a horror movie. Alien begins as a terrifying look into isolation and solitude in space, where they tell me that no one can hear you scream, as it turns out. Alien uses the initial tension to convey somewhat of an existential horror to the viewer, as the crew encounters this derelict alien ship and tries to make sense of what the hell this means for our place in the universe and what this strange life is, though they admittedly take it pretty well and are just kind of hanging out afterwards. Nothing better to help wash down the unknowable infinite horrors of the cosmos than a few brewskis with the boys, am I right, fellas? The build-up with everything from exploring the ship to the face hugger and the acid blood, it all just builds the tension more and more and more until it just bursts. Bursts. Like the chest burst. Do you get it? Do you get? From here on out, there's still the elements of the unknown and, well, Alien, but the predominant horror shifts to being the more slasher, monster movie style formula as the crew gets whittled down one by one. It's similar to how in The Exorcist there's an added religious horror beyond the upfront fear that the possession inspires, when the father's religious crisis is answered in the worst possible way with the confirmation that he is in fact dealing with a straight-up demon from the Bible.
Amen.
Both these latter shifts are still very scary, but they're terrifying in altogether different ways than the parts that preceded them. All I'm trying to say here is that great horror is often multifaceted. If you put all your eggs in one basket, pretty quickly people are going to pick up on what you're doing and it's not going to be as effective. Resident Evil is much the same. I hate to break it to anyone who may have rose-colored glasses on, but the games were never really traditionally scary from start to finish. In my opinion, I don't think they ever even tried to be. They were terrifying at the start of the game, of course, but over a playthrough, that fear naturally fades in the player. There's nothing wrong with that. Once you know the layout of the mansion and understand where to go and what to do, running around the dimly lit halls isn't really as scary anymore. And the game knows this, and of course it does still throw some good moments and scares at you, right? And stuff like Lisa Trevor in the shack is very scary too, sure, but as the game goes on and you're given more and more ways to deal with threats, new guns, more healing, burning corpses, etc., or when you've realized just how effective the secret Joestar family technique is, the new enemies and bosses being introduced aren't frightening, but threatening. A small yet key difference. When you have either the equipment or the knowledge on how to deal with the enemies you're facing, the tension remains, but the fear is kinda gone. Your heart is definitely racing when the tyrant in the lab shows up, or when you find yourself in a closed room with Verdugo, but I would argue it's in a different way than when you find the first zombie in the Spencer Mansion, or when Dr. Salvador makes his first appearance. This is because at its core, I don't think Resident Evil has ever been just a horror game. I think it's been specifically a B-list horror game. For anyone unfamiliar, the term B-movie refers to a kind of smaller, cheaper movie that traditionally was tacked onto a double feature with a larger movie and would usually be of lower quality and shorter runtime. That didn't mean they were intrinsically bad by any means, just of lower production value. Famous examples over the years include things like Evil Dead, Rocky Horror Picture Show, Blair Witch, Nightmare on Elm Street, etc. Because they weren't big studio projects that had tremendous oversight and needed to be hits, these films were where we got a lot of pretty goofy shit. And as time went on, they kind of became a genre of their own regardless of whatever production background they had. And this is where we got stuff like Killer Clowns from Outer Space, Army of Darkness, and the good Nightmare on Elm Street movies. And this side, the goofy B movie, is always what, to me, seemed to be the aim of Resident Evil for the most part. At the risk of stating the obvious here, Resident Evil is a video game, as it turns out, not a movie. And as a result, it's bound by entirely different rules when it comes to horror, one of the main ones being runtime. Horror movies can remain consistently frightening and tense throughout their runtime because they're usually short, right? Maybe 90-100 minutes. The Resident Evil games, on the other hand, on a first run will usually take anywhere from probably 8 to 12 hours on average. Usually. Trying to remain scary over that long of a time frame is extremely difficult, which is why even many horror games tend to be very short themselves. Resident Evil has always known this, and as a result, as the runtime of a game goes on, it doesn't really try and keep the focus on scares and horror in the same way it did at the start. It was always supposed to be a scary but campy and altogether fun romp. I know video game writing and voice acting was pretty rough back in the day, but you can't tell me that a game with Barry Burton in it was supposed to be a terrifying nightmare throughout.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
People seem to overlook the fact that long before we were punching boulders, we were fighting a gigantic snake, a giant sewer gator, and running away from Mecha Sadler. At risk of being ostracized here, I would go so far to say as the first Resident Evil game to focus on being scary more than anything else was Resident Evil 7. The main thing that frustrated me about people trying to argue about what the series is, was, or should be is that to me the series isn't any one thing. It isn't and has never been horror or action, it's always been both. The movie that represents the overall feel of Resident Evil the most to me, put down the keyboard, is Cabin in the Woods. If you haven't seen Cabin in the Woods, go watch it. I'm going to discuss here with the assumption that you know what I'm talking about, so all I'll say is if you haven't seen it, it's a great and fun horror subversion movie where a group of friends go to, well, you know.
Man, we ain't got time for this shit right now. We need to get to that cabin in the woods.
And then bad stuff happens, but in a very different way than usual. Also, Chris Hemsworth is in it right before he got really famous, and he is one of the funniest horror movie deaths I've ever seen. So, you owe it to yourself.
You can't kill me!
See, there are two main reasons that I tend to link the two in my head a bit. The first is that, well, to put it plainly, the overarching plots of the first game and the movie are pretty similar, right? Both have very traditional starts in a normal horror format. We set our scene with our party being stranded in a remote area of the woods, and it quickly becomes evident there's something sinister afoot. We start with a somewhat traditional horror enemy with zombies, but as we go on, the creatures get more and more varied. In RE's case, we have stuff like the dogs, Yawn, Neptune, Lisa Trevor, etc. And in Cabin in the Woods' case, they have a whole smorgasbord of mythical creatures introduced as the cast gets whittled down. And as we go on, there's a wider scientific conspiracy afoot, there's a big underground lab that's the source of all the troubles, and is the location of the climax. You get the idea. Man, a lot of these games end in labs, don't they? Now, the plot similarities only vaguely ring true for the first RE games, I will admit. But the second reason is, if I may speak in somewhat unscientific terms here, the vibes are kind of the same between this movie and the entire series. Just like Resident Evil, Cabin in the Woods is still a horror product, but it also is a very funny and enjoyable movie on top of that. It's not a full parody or comedy movie like Scary Movie is, but rather it's very aware of what it is and has a lot of fun with that throughout.
そして今、キコの魂はこのカエルの中で幸せに生き続けていく。
you! Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you!
While still remaining scary when it wants to be. In my opinion, that's the way most of the Resident Evils tend to operate as well. See, the general idea that used to get thrown around a lot was that Resident Evil 5 was the root of all evil, right? It's where the action became the focus instead of the horror, and although even a lot of haters would begrudgingly admit it's a good game, they would say it's not a good Resident Evil, right? And based on how people talked about RE6, you'd have to assume that the dev team shot their mom and pissed on their dogs or something.
If we didn't have Resident Evil 5 pushing the RE envelope, we might never have gotten Resident Evil 6.
Not like this. Not like this.
And meanwhile, RE4 over here is the neatest thing since sliced bread. Thank you, Shinji Mikami, once again. It revolutionized the series while keeping it scary and cool, and then 5 just shit all over it with the sepia filter, casual racism, and steroid injections. And then 6 happened and Leon killed the president.
I just shot the president.
You what?
So I guess it wasn't all bad. But I've never understood this belief because, Resident Evil 4 is not scary, at all. People act like 5 cranked the action to 11 and forsook everything else, but RE5 is basically the same gameplay and focus as 4, but with a friend. Now, granted, that does inherently reduce any existing scare factor, right? I'm not going to pretend that doing things with a buddy is nearly as scary as when you're on your own. But the gameplay and overall absurdity of everything that happens is really only a rung or two up the ladder from where RE4 was. It's not as different as one might remember. Now, I'm not saying that RE5 didn't change the formula at all. After all, it's very clear that it was heavily influenced by the success of the films, which were basically just action movies where a guy let his wife do cool stunts and then threw an umbrella logo somewhere. But the core identity of Resident Evil is still there in 5. The horror and scares are admittedly less prevalent intentionally, but the tension is the same as ever. There's still some fun little scary stuff like finding the mutated animals and creeping around them in Chapter 5, but it's pretty short-lived, admittedly. However, the tension caused by resource management is again always there, as is the campy B-movie feel. It's all just kinda cranked up to 11. The amount and type of tension and fear inspired change from game to game pretty intentionally. After all, horror more than anything else gets stale upon repetition very quickly. That's why each game always has kind of a big new feature that's unique to it. With RE3, there was Nemesis who stalked you the entire game, and RE4 had Ashley. They all add to that feeling in very unique ways without always having being scary as their constant goal. To kind of illustrate my point here, take a look at this quote from RE4's producer Hiroyuki Kobayashi talking about Ashley. If Ashley gets taken or you shoot her, it's game over. The thing is, when you're surrounded by enemies, it gets pretty chaotic, right? It's really easy then to accidentally shoot her. Ain't that the fucking truth? If you get mobbed by enemies, you can lose sight of Ashley and shoot her by accident. It's like, what just happened? I've experienced that. You've got to be careful. It changes the style of fights having Ashley there. You have to defend her while you fight, so you've got to always be vigilant and careful. Also, if you hurry ahead too quickly, she'll get left behind. You've got to maintain the right amount of space between the two of you. The addition of juggling Ashley around increases the tension you feel significantly, even if some people do hate her for it. Could never be me, I love you, Ashley Graham. And this is done to increase the fear in the player throughout the overall playthrough instead of in individual horror sequences or events. It's done to account for the fact that RE4 is not a horror game. I mentioned a bit ago that the idea that RE5 was the departure point always bugged me because I never thought RE4 was scary. More so, I never thought RE4 was supposed to be scary. And thanks to the research I have for this video, now I have proof that I was right. In that same interview, producer Kobayashi said this: Resident Evil is often called horror, but RE4 is different. I can't say it has zero horror elements, but it's not that strong. If you really want to enjoy a horror game, that would be RE1. It's quite scary. RE4 has much more action. So, that said, if you're really a scaredy cat, it might not be a good choice. RE4 tones down the horror. It's more of a lively shooting action game. Also, you should play it because Leon is really cool, and I would add, I want players to see it as a kind of 007 style game. Well, I couldn't agree more about Leon, and you heard it here first, folks. RE4 is actually a James Bond game.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
But I think on some level, to anyone who's played Resident Evil 4, this isn't really a surprise. The remake, in my opinion, does lean into the darker, scarier aesthetic a bit more to try and retroactively make it scarier than it is, but also we have this. So clearly it's not taking itself completely seriously, right? The thing is here, Resident Evil 4 is much more action heavy than RE1 or 2, but it's still a survival horror game. It just has a lot more emphasis on the survival than the horror. And that makeup of how much survival salt to add to the little horror chili we're brewing here has never been consistent. RE2 was different than RE1, RE2 was different than RE3, 3 was different than 3's remake, 5 was different than 4, 7 was pretty similar to 1, I'll give you that one. You get the idea though. In a way, Resident Evil is kinda like the Final Fantasy of horror. Stay with me here, stay with me. Each game is fairly unconnected from the rest, but they all have the same core common threads running to tie them together, and you don't necessarily have to play each of them or in any specific order to fully enjoy. The key distinction here, of course, being that Ari's through line instead of Gil and Moogles is bioweapons and cool jackets. The long story short here is that to a certain extent, in my opinion, there never has been a definitive Resident Evil. What Ari is and is not has never been cut and dry, but ever changing. Which is exactly what we should expect since the series has passed through so many different hands. The 9 mainline games have had just as many directors, each one molding and shaping in their own image of what their game and the series as a whole should look like. Trying to pigeonhole one Resident Evil game into the shape of another just because you want it to match does a disservice to both games and the series as a whole. I know that I've been talking about a very kind of nebulous concept, right, with the community and gamers, I guess, as a whole, right? But this was actually a problem internally, too. In an interview reflecting on his career, Shinji Mikami spoke on how divisive RE4 was during its initial development, saying, "I do remember receiving a 2-page report fully just packed with comments saying negative things about this is not Resident Evil, this is completely not Resident Evil, and I will not let this happen," he says. "But I was very lucky, I was very strong-hearted, I was able to survive reading all that." Alright, you know the drill at this point, people, here we go, say it with me. Thank you, Shinji Mikami. Mikami's confidence served him very well during the development of RE4, but there is one incident that it led to that I cannot not mention because, holy shit, Mikami felt so confident in the release and development of RE4 that for some reason he promised the game would be exclusive to the Nintendo GameCube forever and threatened to commit harakiri if it was ever ported. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but it did eventually make it off the GameCube, as it turns out. And thankfully he didn't actually disembowel himself, and using his acclaim from RE4 went on to found several of his own studios, including Tango Gameworks. So without RE4, we wouldn't have gotten Hi-Fi Rush. So now everyone say thank you one final time to Shinji Mikami, but this time for Hi-Fi Rush, a game he did not direct, but his company made. Yay! I love Resident Evil. It's hard for me to think of another franchise that has kind of consistently popped up throughout my life like it has. I remember being a kid way before I had the balls to even touch any of the games, and my dad would tell me about how creepy it was the way doors would open in the Spencer Mansion in the first game, and playing Resident Evil 4 in high school for the first time and just falling in love. I don't pretend to have played them all, I'm not going to pretend that I've played all of the weird shitty spin-offs and everything, but I truly mean that I love every one of them that I've played. I was literally moving jobs last spring and delayed my start date by 2 weeks just so I could binge the RE4 remake when it came out. This shit ain't nothing to me, man. Resident Evil is an amorphous blob of a series. It's constantly changing what it is. It was not just a horror game at the start, it was not just an action game in the middle, and it is not just either of those things now. It has always been and will continue to be a mixture of the two, with the scale sliding between which is more prominent from game to game depending on who's in charge. And the series' own flexibilities led to so many awesome games inspired by both the older and newer styles, with each new game putting their own spin on it. There are some games that are more styled after the original few but do put much more emphasis on horror like Signalis, or ones that play like RE4 onwards but with even more commitment to gameplay fidelity like The Evil Within. Everyone say thank you, Shinji. The list goes on and on. The flexibility of the series ensures that every game is always something new, even with 7 and 8, which is part of the fun. I don't know where RE9 will fall on the spectrum of horror versus tension, but I can't wait to find out. Hopefully sooner rather than later. Thanks for watching.
You like it?
Oh, that was great.
Hey everyone, I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone that watched and commented and liked and subscribed and everything from my Elden Ring zip speedrun glitch. I think when I posted that, I had, I think, 3 subscribers that were just my friends, and I hadn't posted anything in over a year because I just got really busy, and for whatever reason, it just completely took off, and now I have like 620 or something. It's been crazy. I never thought more than 20 people would see it, and now there's hundreds of comments and tens of thousands of views, which is just insane. So thank you so much for all of the comments and everything on that, both kind of, you know, positive and constructive and everything. It's super cool and everything to see. Again, yeah, I don't even know what to do with all of this information and this influx. It's just been so amazing. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much. If you're interested in this, if you liked this video and you want to see more, please subscribe and do all that jazz, I guess. I have no idea about a timeline or anything, but I think I have the idea for my next video, and I want to talk about kind of like different prequels and what makes them like good and bad and unnecessary sometimes. I have a few really good examples I want to talk about there. So if that sounds interesting, you know where to find me. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
This case was just too weird. This case was